There is a word you have been reading your entire life that does not exist in the Hebrew Bible. Not once. Not even approximately. The word is miracle. Your translation uses it constantly. It is in the chapter titles, the study notes, the sermon outlines, the devotionals. Pastors stand at the pulpit and say, "The miracles of the Exodus," and everyone nods because everyone knows what they mean. But the writers of the Hebrew Bible did not know what they meant, because they did not have that word. They had 3 different words, and each one means something so distinct that collapsing them into the single English word miracle is not a translation, it is an erasure. You are reading a translation of a translation, and this particular translation made a choice so quietly that almost no one noticed. Let's start with what miracle actually means to you. Take a moment. What is a miracle? You probably said something like, an event that breaks the laws of nature, something impossible that God makes happen, water splitting, dead people walking, fire falling from heaven. That is the modern meaning, shaped by centuries of Western theology, particularly the debates of the medieval church and Enlightenment-era philosophy, which needed a clean category called miracle to argue about whether God interferes with the natural order. The ancient Hebrews were not having that argument. They were not thinking in terms of natural versus supernatural. They were asking a completely different set of questions. Questions like, what does this event point to? What does it reveal? What does it demand from me? And the 3 words they used to describe God's extraordinary acts each answered those questions differently. Stand at the edge of the Reed Sea. The Egyptians are behind you. The water is in front of you. The text says what happens next with a single verb. The waters split. And then, immediately, the Israelites do something the English version almost never emphasizes. They sing. Not because they witnessed a miracle, because they saw 3 different things at once, and the Hebrew gives each one its own name. The first word is ot, Strong's number H226. It appears over 80 times in the Hebrew Bible, and your translation renders it as sign, miracle, token, mark, and wonder, sometimes all in the same book, occasionally in the same chapter. That inconsistency is not accidental. It is the translators wrestling with a Hebrew concept that does not fit neatly into English. Ot does not primarily mean a supernatural event. It means a pointer, a marker, something that stands between 2 parties and says, this relationship is real. Look at the first time it appears in Genesis. When God puts a mark on Cain to protect him from vengeance, that mark is an ot, Genesis 4:15. No supernatural rupture of natural law, just a sign that something is bound, confirmed, established. Then the rainbow. After the flood, God stretches the bow across the sky and says it will be an ot of the covenant, Genesis 9:12. The rainbow does not violate physics. It is a covenantal pointer. Then circumcision, an OT of the covenant between God and Abraham, Genesis 17:11. Then the Sabbath, an OT between God and Israel forever, Exodus 31:13. These are not supernatural spectacles. They are binding marks in covenantal language. And then, only then, does OT get applied to the plagues and the Exodus. Moses stretches his rod over the Nile, and the water turns to blood, and God says, I am multiplying my otot in Egypt. Signs. But what kind of signs? Not random power displays. Pointers to a specific claim, that this God, YHWH, is the one with authority over Pharaoh's empire, over Egypt's gods, over the water and the land and the sky. Each plague is an OT, not merely a supernatural event, but an argument. A piece of evidence in a case that God is making before Egypt, before Israel, and before history. Deuteronomy 6:22 reads, YHWH showed signs and wonders before our eyes. The word for signs there is otot, plural of ot. And notice, the Israelites are meant to remember them, teach them to their children, rehearse them year after year. Why? Because signs require interpretation. A miracle, in the modern sense, happens and is over. An OT keeps pointing. It keeps making its argument. It keeps demanding a response. I have stood in rooms where people dismiss the plagues as legend because they want to find natural explanations. Others dismiss those explanations as faithless, but both arguments are having the wrong fight, the fight that Western categories built. The Hebrew text is not asking, did this violate physics? It is asking, who does this event name as king? That is a completely different question. And ot was the word built to carry it. The second word changes everything again. Mofet, Strong's H4159. It appears 35 times in the Hebrew Bible. And while ot is a pointer that establishes relationship, mofet is something else entirely. It is a conspicuous display. The root, according to Strong's in the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon, carries the sense of something standing out, of conspicuousness, of a thing made visible and undeniable. One scholar traces it to a root meaning to shine forth. The mofet is what you cannot look away from. And this distinction matters because ot and mofet consistently appear appear together as a pair. Deuteronomy 4:34, Deuteronomy 7:19, Deuteronomy 26:8, Deuteronomy 34:11, Psalm 105:27. Every time they show up together, and you have to ask, if they meant the same thing, why would the biblical writers need both? The pairing is intentional. The oat points to the meaning, the mofet makes the power undeniable. Sign and wonder, argument and awe, meaning and spectacle. Together they accomplish what neither does alone. But here's the thing your translation flattens. Mofet has a range that miracle cannot hold. Ezekiel 12:6 uses mofet for a symbolic prophetic act. The prophet carrying his belongings in the dark, acting out the coming exile. No supernatural rupture. Just an action so visible, so striking, so impossible to ignore that it counts as a mofet, a wonder. The Holman Bible Dictionary notes this explicitly. Mofet is a splendid or conspicuous work. The conspicuousness is the point, not the physics-defying quality. And then Exodus 7:9, where Pharaoh demands, "Show us a mofet for you." He wants undeniable proof. He wants something that cannot be explained away. Aaron throws the rod down, it becomes a serpent, and the Egyptian magicians do the same, but Aaron's serpent swallows theirs. The mofet is not merely the transformation, it is the supremacy that the transformation demonstrates. A mofet is an event so conspicuous that it settles the argument. Not just something happened, look at who wins. Exodus 11:9-10 says that God multiplied his moftim in Egypt, not so that the Israelites would believe, but so that Pharaoh would be without excuse. The mofet is aimed outward, at the skeptic, at the enemy, at the power that refuses to bow. It is a confrontation display. And miracle in modern English carries none of that directional, almost polemical energy. Imagine you are in Pharaoh's court. You have your own magicians, you have your own gods, you are the most powerful civilization on earth. And this former slave walks in and starts producing moftim. Wonders so conspicuous, so undeniable, so public, that even your own wise men have to say, this is the finger of God. That is not a magic show. That is a political statement backed by power. The mofet is the power made visible enough that denial becomes absurd. Now we arrive at the third word, and this is the one that will stop you cold. Pele, Pele. Strong's H 6382. 13 occurrences in the noun form, and dozens more from the verbal root pala. And the lexicons are remarkably clear about what it means. Wonder. Something extraordinary, hard to understand. Something that exceeds the category of what is possible for human beings to do or comprehend. Exodus 15:11, the Song of Moses, arguably the oldest poem in the entire Hebrew Bible, sung at the shore of the Reed Sea immediately after the crossing. Who is like you, Yahodove'ech, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, Ose Pele, doing wonder? Not ot, not mofet, Pele. And the distinction is felt. Ot points toward a relationship claim. Mofet confronts with undeniable visibility. Pele reaches into a register that is almost beyond language. The BDB lexicon defines Pele as something extraordinary, hard to be understood. The Jewish Chronicle describes it this way. A Pele is a type of miracle that is beyond our understanding, and links it to the same root used when a legal case is too baffling to decide. Yipale mimcha davar, Deuteronomy 17:8. The word carries the weight of, this surpasses what can be contained in a category. Psalm 77:11. A psalmist in personal crisis, feeling abandoned by God, pushes back against despair with this: I will remember the deeds of Yahweh. I will remember your Pele of old. And then in verse 14, you are the God who does Pele. You have made known your strength among the peoples. What is the Pele the psalmist reaches for in the darkest night? Not a specific event, not a legal argument, not a conspicuous display for Pharaoh's court. The Pele is the irreducible quality of God's acts, the sense that when Yahweh moves in history, the movement exceeds what any category of human understanding can contain. Judges 13:18. The angel appears to Manoah and his wife to announce the birth of Samson. Manoah asks the angel's name. The angel replies, why do you ask my name, seeing it is Peli, the adjectival form, meaning hidden, beyond naming, incomprehensible. The name belongs to a register of reality that language cannot capture, and the same root is in that name. The Pele and the unnamed angel share the same quality. They exceed what can be held. Here is the thing your translation did. It took 3 Hebrew words with completely different registers: the covenantal pointer, the conspicuous confrontational display, the incomprehensible excess of divine action, and it poured them all into one English cup. miracle. And that cup holds some of it, but it was not built to hold all of it. You lost the argument that otot makes. You lost the confrontational direction of mofet, and you almost completely lost the stunned, language-breaking quality of Pele, the sense that what God does is not just unlikely, it is beyond what a human mind can fully process. Now let's sit with what the honest, scholarly picture looks like, because there is more to say here, and the honest version is actually more interesting than the popular one. Scholars are clear that these three words do overlap. The Biblical Theological Seminary materials acknowledge that otot and mofet are, quote, often synonymous in certain contexts, and frequently appear as a paired formula. The encyclopedia tradition notes that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible made around the 3rd century BCE, sometimes translates mofet and Pele interchangeably with teras, the Greek for portent. This tells us that even the ancient translators felt these categories blurring at the edges. And no serious scholar claims that the Hebrew writers were working with an explicit, rigid taxonomy, sitting down and saying, this event gets otot, not mofet, because of these criteria. The words live in a tradition. They have tendencies, not laws. The Encyclopedia Judaica notes directly, Biblical Hebrew has no word corresponding to the English miracle. That is not a flaw in Hebrew. It is a flaw in what we expected Hebrew to have. The ancient Israelites were not trying to define miracle as a philosophical category. They were naming what they experienced, and they named it with precision, more precision, not less, than the English tradition gave back. What the overlap tells us is not that the distinctions are false. It tells us that the event at the Reed Sea, for example, carried all three dimensions at once: covenantal pointer, undeniable conspicuous power, and incomprehensible excess. The ancient writers did not have to choose. The English translation did. Deuteronomy 26:8 captures this layering perfectly. When Israel rehearses its foundational story before God, it says, Yahweh brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with otot and moftim, signs and wonders. Not miracle, not miracle. Signs and wonders, two words, held together, pointing to two different registers of the same event. The events at Egypt were arguments about sovereignty. They were displays that left Pharaoh without excuse. They were also moments of Pele, something that exceeded what any human court or human word could contain. And you read, miracles. One word. The argument is gone, the confrontation is gone, the incomprehensible excess is gone. What remains is a generic category of supernatural events, which is useful for Western theological argument, but is not what the text said. Now take the most famous verse connected to all of this, Exodus 34:10. God renewing the covenant with Moses after the golden calf. Behold, I am making a covenant. Before all your people I will do niflaot, wonders, such as have not been created in all the earth or in any nation. Niflaot, the plural form of Pele. These are the things beyond comprehension. God is not saying, I will perform events that violate natural law. He is saying, I will do things so far outside the category of what can be understood or compared that all the people surrounding you will see YHWH's work, because nothing like it has been done. Under the English word miracle, this reads as a promise of supernatural power. Under niflaot, it reads as a promise of incomprehensible uniqueness. God is not just saying, I will be impressive. He is saying, what I am about to do will rupture the category of what can be named, and the people who see it will know that they are standing inside a story that exceeds any story they had before. That is a completely different claim, and it changes how you pray. It changes how you remember. It changes how you tell the story to your children. Here is where this lands, not in a seminary classroom, but in your actual life. When you pray for a quote-unquote miracle, what are you asking for? Physics to break? A supernatural event to override the situation? That is a legitimate prayer, but the Hebrew gives you more room. You can pray for an otot, a sign that confirms what God has said, a pointer that arrives in a moment of doubt and says, the covenant is still real. You can pray for a mofet, something so conspicuous, so undeniable, that the people around you who are skeptical have to reckon with what they saw. And you can encounter Pele, not pray for it exactly, because Pele is not in the category of things you arrange. Pele is what happens when God moves in a register that exceeds your theology. When the thing that happens does not fit inside the framework you brought to the moment. Have you ever experienced that? Not just something good happening, but something happening that broke your category for what you thought God did. Something that left you not with an explanation, but with a kind of stunned, reverent speechlessness. The Hebrews had a word for that. Your translation buried it under the one word that could not hold it. And there is something else that the three-word system reveals about the Hebrew understanding of God. Otot assumes relationship, there is a covenant, and the sign belongs to it. Mofet assumes audience. The wonder is displayed before witnesses, directed outward, confrontational in its conspicuousness. Pele assumes mystery. The action of God exceeds language itself. These are not three types of supernatural events. They are three angles on a God who makes covenants, who confronts powers, and who cannot be reduced to any category you bring to the encounter. Think about the moments in your own life when God felt distant. The psalmist in Psalm 77 is in that place. His soul refuses to be comforted. He wonders if God has forgotten to be gracious, whether his steadfast love has ceased forever. And the psalmist's answer is not a theology lecture. He says, I will remember your Pele of old. He does not reach for the argument. He does not rehearse the confrontation. He reaches for the thing that exceeded language, the incomprehensible thing that God did, and he holds it in the dark. When was the last time you held a Pele in the dark? Not an argument for God's existence. Not a story you can explain in 3 points. Something that happened that still exceeds your category for what happened. Something you cannot quite fit inside a testimony. Those are the things the Hebrew Bible calls Pele. Not miracles, not supernatural events, wonders. Things beyond the comprehension of what you could have imagined, done by a God whose name is itself, according to the angel in Judges 13, Pele, beyond naming. What does it change for you? What shifts in how you read the Exodus, how you pray, how you remember Pele, when you realize that the writers were describing 3 different dimensions of divine action, and your translation gave you only one? Leave that in the comments. I genuinely want to know what opened up for you. If you want to go deeper into the exact language the biblical writers chose, subscribe, because this is what we do here. Every word, every weight, every dimension that the translation left on the floor. Next time, we are going inside the Hebrew word yirah, typically rendered as fear in the phrase fear of the Lord. But the lexicons tell a different story about what yirah actually means, and it is not what the sermon told you. It is something closer and more demanding than fear. 3 words, 1 translation. And what you lost was not a technicality. It was the entire architecture of how Israel understood the God who acted in their history. That architecture was built over centuries, carried in 3 words, and collapsed into one the day your Bible was printed.